Welcome to the panel on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Today, we're going to talk about the regional element of the invasion. Russia's invasion has not only affected Ukraine, but dramatically disrupted relations between Russia and the rest of the world. A couple of weeks ago, we had a panel on its impact in Central Europe. In 2 weeks, we're going to have a panel on its impact on China and China's impact on the war. Today, we're going to talk about four very important countries: Belarus, Georgia, Kazakhstan, and then also Turkey. We have with us very wonderful experts who can speak to the impact of the war on these countries. First, from Turkey, we have Filiz Tutku Aydin, who is assistant professor of the social sciences at the University of Ankara. Sorry, I pronounced that wrong. She received her PhD from political science in 2012, and she's writing a book, Emigre, Exile, Diaspora, and Transnational Movements of Crimean Tatars, Preserving the Eternal Flame. That book's already been published by Palgrave. And she's also editing a forthcoming book on the occupation of Crimea in Turkish. Next, we have David Marples, who doesn't need any introduction. He's from anybody. He has published a total of 16 single-authored books, 100 articles in peer-reviewed journals. That's more than 3 times what most people have in their entire careers, I would say. And he's sort of considered, I think, the preeminent Western expert on Belarusian politics. Then we have Edward Schatz, who is known to all of you. He as an expert on Kazakhstan. He's a professor at the University of Toronto. And if I'm allowed to say, am I allowed to say this, Ed? I don't know, but he's published a book called Slow Anti-Americanism, Social Movements and Symbolic Politics in Central Asia with Stanford University Press. It's a wonderful book. He's also published Paradox of Power, The Logics of State Weakness in Eurasia. And he's also known for his methodology, as well as his study of Kazakhstan, his book, Political Ethnography, What Immersion Contributes to the Study of Power. Finally, he's been very involved in a wonderful project on China's Belt and Road Initiative. Then finally, last but not least, from Georgia, we have Ghia Nodia, who's been involved in pro-democracy politics for decades. He's professor of politics and director of the International School of Caucasus in the Ilia State University of Tbilisi. He's also founder of the Caucasus Institute for Peace, Democracy, and Development. And in February to December 2008, he served as Minister of Education and Science for Georgia. He has published extensively on democratization, state building, security, and conflicts in Georgia and the Caucasus, theories of nationalism, democratic transition in the post-Cold War context. So I think today we're going to start off with the former Soviet Union and then move on to Turkey. So we'll start off with you, David. So I think all of us have been struck by Lukashenko's tremendous, kind of U-turn. I always thought of, Lukashenko as someone who is, obviously beholden to Russia for extensive aid and support, but he's always shown a kind of this independent streak. And I always got the sense that Putin, really would have preferred if he had his choice to work with someone else. But now we've seen a Lukashenko who feels like he's almost become the right-hand man of Putin in the war. I mean, would you agree with that characterization? And how do you can you just talk about Belarus's kind of shift in its relationship to Russia and its role in the war?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're correct that he is now seen as close to Putin. The change really happened after the elections of August 2020, when, by most accounts, Lukashenko lost that election. There were mass protests in Belarus, and they were followed by a mass crackdown that really led to repressions of society, arrests of about 35,000 people over the past 18 months, over 1,000 political prisoners. It's almost been a complete evisceration of Belarusian opposition and society. And Lukashenko really from that time has been struggling to survive. And he's found that Russia, whom he lambasted at the beginning of his presidential campaign, is now his one reliable ally. He's relied on Russia for a loan of $1.5 billion. He's reliant on Russia to keep himself in power. His foreign policy is now blended with that of Russia. And the military exercise, of course, that was taking place between February 10 and 20 in Belarus, more impromptu than part of a regular series. And this is what led to incursions from Belarusian territory of Russian troops and missiles fired from Belarusian territory to Ukrainian cities. And so Lukashenko has been weakened, seriously weakened. And I would say that he's more today like a supplicant rather than a partner of Putin. His language has changed. He listens to Putin. Putin never comes to Minsk. Lukashenko always goes to Moscow. It's a one-sided relationship. And Lukashenko, I think, is very weak now, a very weak leader in Belarus.
Great. But how do you see sort of Belarusian society and its relationship to the invasion? We've heard about this brigade, the Kostas Kalinowski brigade, that's sort of been fighting of Belarusians opposition fighting in Ukraine. I mean, is this how important is this? And so where's the Belarusian population, would you say? I mean,
yeah, it's a big question. And recently there have been a couple of surveys done. I mean, before I even comment, I want to say that I'm not 100% certain how reliable these surveys are from Chatham House and one from Ukraine. And they suggest that Belarusian society is rather divided on the war. Yes, there is the Kalinowski Brigade, but overall, 97% of those responding didn't want Belarus to play any role in the war at all. And of the rest, mostly, I would say, was completely divided between pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian, with a slight preponderance for the pro-Russian part. But the society is badly divided in that the people, let's say, who are elderly, who rely on official television to get their information, are more likely to support the Russian version of events in Ukraine. Those who are in social media, younger, more highly educated, tend to support the Ukrainians' position, but without necessarily thinking that Belarusians should get involved in the war. So there's a strong tendency in Belarus of non-participation in military events outside the country and reluctance to take part, and opposition to the fact that Belarus has been dragged into this war. So I think that would be roughly what I would say about the situation. And I would say that of those that do support the Russian side, their level of knowledge about what is happening in Ukraine is very low. That is, they have no knowledge of bombing of cities, of bombing civilian centers. They just see this as a special mission of Russia to knock out a neo-Nazi regime and to hit military installations. And that's the limit of their knowledge. So that is my big qualifier in how Belarusian society would perceive this war.
Great, thank you. So I think now we'll go to another country that's even in a more vulnerable position, Georgia, Ghia, Nodia. I noticed that the Georgian government is not participating in sanctions. I mean, can you sort of talk a little bit about sort of the kind of what's been described as the kind of tightrope that Georgia is walking right now with regards to Ukraine? Obviously, in 2008, Russia invaded Georgia, so I would assume that there's some empathy for Ukraine's situation. But what is going on now here?
Okay, I think we have very paradoxical situation in Georgia, because on the one hand, we have a really overwhelming support for Ukraine in Georgia. It's traditional, one would say, because if we discount Baltic states as a special case, within Soviet Union, Georgians and Ukrainians were the most resistant to Russian rule. to Russian domination. These are the only two nations which strongly aspire to membership of NATO, etc. And it's also logical that both of us were punished by Russia for these kind of policies. In 2008, they invaded Georgia, in 2015, and now, of course, they invaded Ukraine. So there is this very strong sense of linkage within Georgian society, as well as Ukrainian society, one would say. So we had a poll. I know only one poll, so conducted in Georgia, and 88% said they wished victory of Ukraine, and only 1% wanted victory to Russia. 87% agreed that this is also our war, that Ukrainians are fighting our war. That's very strong feeling in Georgia. And also 72% thought that if Russia wins, if Russia prevails, we will be the next target, which is sort of logical because, okay, Putin's justification was that Ukraine should revoke its NATO aspirations, and there is only another country that has NATO aspirations, and it's Georgia. And so if you come to Tbilisi, you know, there are Ukrainian flags everywhere. So it's just very visible and pronounced and emotional also, the support. People say they cannot do anything. They all watch things in Ukraine and so on. But on the other hand, we have very inconsistent behavior of Georgian government. So on the one hand, they show support for Ukraine. They feel sort of obliged to show this support, and they have this kind of laundry list of we did this, this, and this. You know, they voted into UN, of course, condemning Russian aggression. They also joined this call for International Criminal Court to probe alleged war crimes by Russian war crimes in Ukraine. So we were, no, it was not, there are too many countries who did that, but we were one of them. And some other things. So they always have something to say that we are for Ukraine, of course. But they're not only that they didn't join sanctions, but their rhetoric, general rhetoric, is not friendly to Ukraine. One says that Prime Minister sort of indirectly, when he announced non-joining sanctions, it was, I think, one could understand him that we are afraid to kind of, you know, alienate Russia too much, make Russia too angry, and also our economy is very much tied up with Russian economy. So I would say that he might have made a legitimate claim that we cannot afford this. And Moldova also did not join sanctions, and Moldova is considered, you know, as very pro-Western, it has very pro-Western government, etc. But it could be excused for that in a way. But his sum total of rhetoric and actions show that somehow Georgian government is not really supportive of Ukraine. I think they probably feel that because of this overwhelming support, and there were huge rallies, of course, of solidarity of Ukraine, they politically cannot afford not to show support for Ukraine. And also, of course, they want to continue these ties with the West. But the rhetoric is that, okay, Ukraine, they indirectly blamed Ukraine for the war, in part at least, that Zelensky failed to avoid the war, so he was too provocative, supposedly, towards Russia, that these sanctions are jokes, they will not work, and Ukraine is sort of doomed, nothing can stop Russia now, this kind of thing. So actually, many Georgians are fighting in the war, actually went as volunteers, and we have 4 fatalities already, Georgians dying for Ukraine. And when two bodies were, you know, there was a very huge burial, it was a funeral in the largest church in Tbilisi, but nobody from government came. Georgian parliament refused to allow Zelensky to address it, which was especially scandalous. I mean, Zelensky is addressing, it's kind of honor almost, yeah, to be addressed by Zelensky these days for a parliament. And Georgia, is traditionally very close friend to Ukraine, somehow refuses Zelensky to talk to Georgian parliament. That was really scandalous. So we see that Russian diplomats, official diplomats, actually praise Georgia for its sort of moderate and good position. And by Zelensky summoned his ambassador for consultations for several days. So he showed his unhappiness with Georgian position. And especially, of course, Georgia was expected to show real solidarity. So why is this so? I think there is official reason, and I think another reason, which I think is also important, official reasons that we are cautious. And that is what is sold to the people, that we have to be cautious because we were attacked in 2008, so we should not give Russia a pretext to attack us again. So, and that sort of sells more or less well with the public. So, because there is some rationale behind that. But I think there is another reason, and my feeling is that that reason may be more important, is that Zelensky is sort of identified with Georgian opposition, with Saakashvili. And the leader of Georgian Dream, the party of power, he said that, you know, people who are in opposition here, they're in government in Ukraine. So, and because opposition is not just, you know, opposition, loyal opposition or Her Majesty, it's criminal opposition. That's how normally kind of Georgian government addresses opposition. They are criminals. And now in these days, they call them party of war. They want us to get directly involved in war. And that's their message box. They're repeating it all the time. And so they are somehow in cahoots with Zelensky to draw Georgia into the war. And so basically, I would say that they criticize Zelensky much more often than they criticize Putin as a kind of friend of their opposition. So for them, I guess survival, political survival, and fighting the opposition is #1 priority. And that makes them unfriendly to Ukrainian government as sort of ally of their opposition. And so their rhetoric, I would not call it openly pro-Russian, but okay, it's often more anti-Ukrainian than anti-Russian.
So what I find odd about that, I mean, is that you would think, you know, if, as you say, the Ukrainian position is so popular in Georgia, I mean, you would think that the Georgian government would want to at least, I mean, I can understand why it would refrain from sanctions, as you say. I mean, obviously it's very dependent on Russia, but you'd think it would sort of use any kind of symbolic opportunity to sort of, you know, at least show allegiance with Ukraine, you know, something that didn't go too far. I mean, do you think that sort of this, I mean, is this undermining the popularity of Georgian Dream, or is sort of Georgia gone in such an authoritarian direction that public opinion doesn't matter the way it used to, or what do you think?
No, it does matter, and government is very afraid of public opinion and of people in the street. But okay, they have their base, right? And their base is the main idea of, or bonding force of their base is hatred of Saakashvili and the national movement. So their identity is of Georgian Dream, as they came to power from the very beginning, and still is, that they are people who prevent Saakashvili, or the Nazi as they call. So it's interesting also kind of parallel that Putin calls Zelensky Nazi and the Georgian government calls its own opposition Nazi, that they are preventing first they drew Saakashvili out of power, and now they preventing Saakashvili and his supporters to come to power. That's what basically their core support comes from, those people who feel like this. And so they cannot overcome this. They are very much, they believe that they have to keep that core support active. And these core supporters are often anti-Western, anti-liberal, appealing to some kind of religious fundamentalism, if you wish, or things like that. So, they have to keep these people kind of active.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm going to turn to you, Ed. So if thinking about Belarus, in some ways, Kazakhstan's in a parallel position. It feels like the president was sort of saved by Russia. Yet it feels like, correct me if I'm wrong, but Kazakhstan's approach to the invasion has been, almost, very, very different from Lukashenko's. So how do you, first of all, do you think, to what extent has sort of Kazakhstan, do you think, sort of acted in a kind of independent way and to buck Russia, at least, in subtle ways? And if so, how do you explain this sort of relative independence?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and thanks for organizing the panel. Really interesting so far. So, the starting points are of course different, right? When this invasion happens, or even if you want to go a few months back to the buildup toward the invasion. Kazakhstan had diversified its geopolitical portfolio a long time ago, was proud of what it called its multi-vector foreign policy. Some of that was rhetorical, a lot of it was not. And so what it was a sort of massive hedging of bets, geopolitically, geoeconomically as well. And one could talk about moving parts at different moments in Kazakhstan's independence history, but the general contours of this attempt to balance different geopolitical, geoeconomic forces never really disappeared. So that's one key difference, I think, from Belarus. Kazakhstan, of course, has enormous natural resource wealth, which distinguishes it from Belarus, and so it enables Kazakhstan to forge relationships and to hedge its bets really around the globe in ways that produce some distancing from Russia, but not as much as might make the Kazakhstani authorities feel comfortable, which is why you saw in January of this year, on the heels of a mass uprising that was the product of a confluence of factors, but basically rising fuel prices and waning legitimacy of the previous of the outgoing president, Nazarbayev. You saw mass protests, people taking to the streets, and it eventually devolved into some violence in some cities, particularly Almaty. And at that moment, Tokayev, the incumbent president, requested from the CSTO, the Russia-led security alliance, troops, and I think they were there, for 10 days in the country at Kazakhstan's request, long enough to highlight the vulnerability of the Kazakhstani regime to domestic audiences, but perhaps not so long that it became a fundamental liability, because there was a rising discourse, rising very quickly in those 10 days, about essentially Tokayev selling the sovereignty of the country to Russia, right, in order to preserve his own authoritarian rule. And had those troops stayed longer, I think that discourse would have taken hold a lot more strongly. It's there still, and I think the sensitivity is there within Kazakhstani society. So there's a kind of a push me pull you, right? There's, on the one hand, there's the pull of close economic ties with Russia. So nothing about what I said about balancing really undermines the close economic ties that do exist with Russia. So you have, much of the oil and energy transportation runs through Russian pipelines, which creates all sorts of interesting and, of course, in the current situation, problematic dynamics. Kazakhstan's, the north of the country, its energy grid is essentially run by Russian companies. Kazakhstan relies on the lion's share of its imports from Russia, right? Manufactured goods, especially, machinery for industry and so on. So there's just an enormous reliance and enormous interconnectivity that, it comes, I suppose, from being geographically contiguous, but also it's developed, I think these ties have been thickened over the past couple of decades. And if you watch like the collapse of the ruble, I guess the ruble has sort of recovered somewhat, but the tenge, the Kazakhstani currency, has basically mirrored it's been less dramatic and less disruptive, but nonetheless the sort of patterns have been quite similar. So there are economic ties, there are strong political ties. The key difference here, and I think it probably goes for it's probably a contrast to Belarus, certainly is a contrast to Ukraine, is the position that Kazakhstan occupies in sort of the Russian imaginary, right? That is to say, Ukraine obviously occupies this sort of liminal space between, ours and theirs, and it's become so ultimately fraught, right? The center of the origins of the Russian state and so on. And one could talk separately about Belarus. Kazakhstan doesn't offer that kind of dilemma. If Kazakhstan starts to drift a little bit from Russia's orbit, there's really not, at the moment at least, a huge concern about where it would go. There's no discussion about joining NATO. There's no discussion about joining the European Union. There's no discussion about some kind of vibrant Central South Asian kind of connectivity. All these things exist. There are ties of various sorts, but they're very unlikely to appear to be a threat to sort of the Kremlin, which I think gives Kazakhstan a tiny bit more breathing room as it begins to chart out a course which is somewhat independent. And yet it doesn't step on too many, on Russia's toes. So just a couple of last quick things on this. Tokayev has said, we're not, we want to play peacemaker, we want to be neutral, for whatever that means in the context. But some of his officials have come out with statements essentially saying we're not sending troops unless it's mandated by the UN, unless it's part of a UN mandated force, right? So that already suggests sort of where this is going. And then finally, I'll say this, I don't think at the moment, Putin couldn't handle trying to actually bring Kazakhstan into the war effort. I think it would take too much capital, and if it's coercion, it would be, I think, impossible. I think the war effort has sucked all of his energies that direction. But at the same time, I think he also recognizes, likely, no one knows what's in the man's head, but the moment in Kazakhstan right now, because there is rising populism. It's not the kind of populism that we see in the West, but there's a sort of sense that we need a populist authoritarianism that provides public goods. There's a huge commitment to social spending on the part of the new government. So far, we'll see if it materializes, but nonetheless, something probably will. And the current government has to be seen as distinguishing itself from the previous one of Nazarbayev, by which it's been allowing some protests that are essentially protests in support of Ukraine. They're not huge protests, they're there. At the same time, it has arrested a couple of opposition figures who have played a part in these kinds of protests. So allowing some space, handing a little goodie to Russia, at least in terms of public relations. And this is part of the ongoing balancing act that it faces.
So I'm interested actually to kind of follow up on that, because what's interesting in Ghia's discussion, about the relationship between Zelensky and the opposition in Georgia, and obviously in Belarus, even more so, there's a kind of relationship between Zelensky and the opposition in Belarus. Do you see any of that? Is sort of Zelensky identified with opposition in Kazakhstan, or is that you don't see that?
One of the things that I hesitate to say this because I'm not on the ground, but from the people I talk to, it's clear that there's basically a hush over Kazakhstan right now. This was happening already because of the sort of, exhaustion from the violence in January, sort of a demobilization that was happening. And I think that the opposition, such as it was, right, leaderless, really skewing young. These type of people were hoping that there would be some kind of political reform. That's, of course, has been overtaken by concern about the war. But I think that most people are not actually discussing this, and you don't actually see the opposition, at least as far as the real opposition, which gets to a key point, right? What's the real opposition in the Kazakhstani case, right? It's been consistently undercut over the years. It exists, but it's these are people, you know, active on social media, but largely ignored and in sort of the halls of you know, the brick and mortar halls of politics, and so it ends up being not all that consequential. But I do think that it is inspiring, and you can see some of the symbolic things that are being done, adopted rather by young people on social media. These kinds of the solidarity being expressed broadly with Ukraine, if not with you know, Zelensky in particular.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, Belarus. I mean, there is no opposition, as you say, in Kazakhstan, or almost none. Great, thank you so much. So now we're going to turn to Turkey, which is obviously a very important player in the conflict right now. I was looking at a table, I forget where, of types of military assistance to Ukraine, and they had, you know, 8 different categories, and it felt like Turkey checked almost every single box. Of course, the most famous is the Bayraktar drones, which have become sort of celebrities on social media. You know, we see all those videos. All of us have seen them sort of destroying Russian tanks. I mean, at the same time, sort of, I think it's a really puzzling case to a lot of us, because, you know, it all comes down to sort of the relationship between, you know, 2 dictators, Erdogan and Putin. So maybe, Professor Aydin, maybe you can just start by sort of tell us, you know, can you just help us understand that relationship and how this translates into sort of Turkey's engagement in the war?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for inviting me to this great panel. The relationship between Erdogan and Putin is basically personal, we could say that. They conduct their foreign policy by a high-level meetings between each other. So it's not an institutionalized policy. And that's what a lot of, you know, Russian studies experts keep telling in Turkey. This relationship has no institutional basis. I mean, it isn't something like a relationship between European Union and Turkey, where a lot of, you know, other officials and civil servants come and they open many chapters and have a lot of, you know, bureaucratic things going on, or relationship between Turkey and United States. And sometimes there has been some scandals that, you know, nobody other than the translator has been in the room. And I think this style of relationship, both leaders believe, is more effective in making things quicker, because this was one of the reasons Turkish president wanted to transit into this transfer into this presidential system. And I even feel there is something about it with Zelensky, because he also keeps asking to see Putin one-on-one. So I would say this is more like a Eurasian type of foreign policy making, which sometimes Westerners miss, and that's why they don't understand how can Turkey compete and cooperate at the same time, right? This is what we call, you know, here we try to kind of theorize it. We say it, you know, is it compartmentalization? Is it trying to not to step in each other's foot in war zones, right? Syria, Libya, and other places. So they have this kind of pragmatic, I would say, both leaders have a way of relating and conducting their relations.
Great. So can you talk a little bit about Turkey's military assistance? I mean, it does, at least looking at it from some ways, seem like Turkey is among the biggest providers of lethal assistance to Ukraine. I mean, is that your perception? And why is it? Is it kind of a purely commercial interaction, or is there something else going on? I mean, does everyone have a kind of geopolitical agenda of counterbalancing Russia and not wanting to see a too strong Russia, or sort of, can you talk a little bit about the sort of impetus behind that military assistance?
Okay. Well, I think I would say both. I mean, we shouldn't minimize the economic dimension either. Turkey's economy, as you know, has one of the highest inflation rates right now in the world. And it has a lot of, balancing problems, currency crisis. And that is why and Turkey's military-industrial complex has been growing for the last 10 years. So in the Turkish media, there was a lot of, interpretations that, the Ukrainian war has shown, how effective the Bayraktar drones, and maybe we will have more customers in the future. There has been this aspect. But there is also, I think, this geopolitical aspect, which is, I think, Turkey prefers a strong Ukraine in the region. I mean, that's kind of logical, because Russia has proved that it is an expansive power, it is aggressive power, and it doesn't accept multilateralism in the region, right? It asks for multilateralism globally, but wants to be the regional hegemon. So it's just only rational for Turkey to use, Russia as a use Ukraine as a counterbalance to Russia, and for this reason, Turkey, I think, takes up this risk of selling the Bayraktars, and it can manage it. Although Putin many times expressed his dissatisfaction with Turkey's behavior. But Turkey has done it in many other spaces, right? In Syria, in Libya, in Azerbaijan, of course, Nagorno-Karabakh. So in many cases, Turkey is not scared of challenging Putin. And many analysts say, maybe West should learn from Turkey, because this is what Putin understands, right?
Right. Can you talk a little bit about, the public support for the, for Ukraine in Turkey? What's the level there?
Recent poll shows it is more than 50%. People are supporting Ukraine and against Russia's war. But it is not maybe as high as in Georgia or in Eastern Europe. Because still many people don't see it, as their war or as a direct threat to their nation, because of, I think, the comfortable position of being a NATO member, perhaps, and also because of the certain engagement between Russia. So they don't see an immediate threat. But and also Turkish public is more sensitive to Middle Eastern issues, Islamic issues, such as plight of the Palestinians or Bosnians have been much more. People got interested in these issues much more, and also President Erdogan. His earlier election strategy, he had this anti-NATO discourse, which sounds so weird because we are a part of NATO, right? But he did this, kind of propaganda that of Turkey's independence or sovereignty is somewhat under danger from NATO, which didn't really, have any realistic basis. But this rhetoric still has, a lot of people buy this rhetoric. And moreover, Russian propaganda channels such as Sputnik and others are operate in Turkey as in Serbia. These are the only two, European countries who didn't shut those channels. And apart from that, there are also a lot of other pundits, the so-called Eurasianists, you know, they think that, you know, Eurasia can be another geopolitical alternative to European Union for Turkey. And they also have this pro-Russian position. I don't know to what extent they're also perhaps supported by Russia financially, because we know that as part of Russia's hybrid strategy, it has been doing such things and financing many media outlets, right, in both in the West and in Turkey.
Right. So I just want to ask you also about the Crimean Tatars. You've done a lot of research on that. I mean, can you talk a little bit about their perspective in this conflict? I mean, obviously, you know, they saw it much earlier in 2014. But you know, what is
right?
Talk a little bit about their perspective.
Well, when it comes to Crimean Tatars, they are now divided into between mainland Ukraine and Crimea, right? So when this Russian invasion of Ukraine first happened, the ones in Crimea were, of course, very scared, because they were scared of being scapegoated or being regarded as a fifth column. But there has not been so far, and we hope, you know, there won't be such kind of. But it was the usual operation, right? Just after the occupation of Crimea, 250 Crimean Tatars imprisoned for totally, you know, made up reasons, and the house searches as a tactic of intimidation from the Soviet times, right, is usually you know, applied every 1 or 2 days. So there is this usual repression going on, and their culture is totally repressed. Cultural assimilation is going on. We learn, you know, they make the Crimean Tatar kids to learn by heart some of the Soviet poems and songs, which are actually, you know, demonizing their own nation, right? This is just what we argue is what is happening is kind of a cultural genocide, because if in any case, right, Crimea is left to Russia, if in any negotiations after war, these are testament to what is going to happen to Crimean Tatars. So the ones in mainland Ukraine, the ones politically exiled from Crimea, the Crimean Tatar Mejlis, is of course always bringing this issue with Zelensky, and that Crimea should never be sacrificed, right? And there has been very good relationship between the Crimean Tatar, you know, political representation and all Ukrainian governments, both Poroshenko and Zelensky. Even Ukrainian government recognized the rights of indigenous people, their status as indigenous people, which would mean national cultural autonomy for them in Crimea, in case, you know, Crimea is returned, you know, de facto to Ukraine. So if Crimea is in any case, you know, left to Russia, this would be like punishing the Crimean Tatars, although they have all along been loyal to Ukraine despite huge costs, and all along supported democracy, NATO, EU, right? All Western institutions. I would say not since 2014 or anything since 1950s, right? They were one of the largest dissident movements in Soviet Union, and they said that if within this communist regime, we dream no national autonomy. Only if, you know, communism collapses and democracy is established in the Soviet Union, then we can have proper, you know, freedom and our national rights. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Olga, do we have any questions from the audience, or you please feel free to use your, I think, the Q&A function. In the meantime, I'm just going to ask another question to the panelists, which is sort of, at least from the perspective of a lot of sort of Western observers, the Russian army has turned out to be much weaker than most people thought. And I'm just wondering, how, I mean, I can't imagine this, this has not sort of had some impact on countries of the former Soviet Union in terms of their sort of attitude towards Putin, their fear. I mean, maybe I'll start with you, David. I mean, sort of, is there a kind of, first of all, I guess, is there any recognition of the fact that the sort of by the Belarusian elite or anybody that the Russian army has done much more poorly than we thought, and sort of what impact might that have on Belarusian-Russian relations?
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer because, as mentioned before, Belarusians do not see a full picture of what is happening, so they're most likely to be unaware of the scale of the losses of the Russian ground forces. Remember, there are no Belarusian forces that have crossed the border, as far as we know, other than fighting the one unit fighting on the Ukrainian side. And so Belarusians don't really have much of an idea that Russia's incurred such losses. And I think also there's a tradition between the two of the Operation Zapad exercises that preceded the exercise on the verge of the invasion. And in those exercises, they're always working together against a simulated attack from NATO and how this attack would be repelled. Belarusians themselves have got a sizable army, but in the past, it's also not been particularly effective whenever it's been called upon to some kind of emergency situation. I mean, there was an episode of, when the Swedish group dropped some teddy bears over Minsk and caused great ridicule of the Belarusian military forces, and the previous incident with a balloon back in the 1990s where the military proved incapable of shooting it down. So I don't think at the moment this has had much of an impact on Belarusian elite. The other question is, who really is the Belarusian elite right now? We know that about up to 200,000 Belarusians have left in recent months, now in different parts of Europe. Virtually the entire opposition that's not in jail is in different cities of Europe now. And so what you've got left is Lukashenko and his Security Council. It's a very closed society, and that's who he's speaking to. And he's more involved in this ridiculous things like trying to reform the constitution through a popular assembly, which is more or less appointed by himself. So there's no real indication that Belarusians are getting much inside information into the war. If they were, then you may see some reaction. I mean, you really may see some reaction. And if Belarus was dragged into this war, if military forces are compelled to take part, then I think you would see a strong reaction from the Belarusian public.
So do you think that's a likelihood, or at all? I mean, I guess you can't read the mind of Lukashenko, but if you were going to bet on whether, isn't it wonderful when people ask you these impossible questions? I get to ask these questions all the time, so it's my small revenge because I get to ask you. I mean, so what I mean, do you think? I mean, what is your thought about whether Belarus is likely to get directly involved in the war?
Well, I mean, the problem is, as I mentioned, for Lukashenko is that he's really got nowhere to turn. He's got no alternative. And in the past, he's very skillfully played being a part of the European partnership project with the EU and played that off against joining Russian structures and the degree to which Belarus has participated in Russian structures, which up until a couple of years ago was very half-hearted and now seems to be complete volte-face. It's going to complete change. And now Belarus has not really got much choice about doing that. So, I don't know how Lukashenko could resist if Putin simply said, you have to take part. Because on the face of it, Belarus is already occupied by Russian forces. It's occupied by the Russian army. It was occupied before Ukraine. It's just that there is a facade of Belarus remaining independent and having some independent structure, its own parliament, etc., its own court, its upper house. And Belarus has been taking steps actually to resist the formation of pro-Russian political parties, which are being pushed forward by the Russian side. And the integration attempts over the past 2 years have been intensive, absolutely intensive. And Belarus has resisted to some extent. But it is losing its options. It's really losing its independence and its sovereignty. And if it does join in this war at the behest of Russia, I would say the independence is lost completely. And that will not go down well in Belarusian society anywhere. So I think that's an option where Lukashenko would only do if his job was on the line, if his presidency was on the line, which of course it could be. It really could be, because he could be replaced.
So Ghia, can you talk a little bit about, I mean, at least my impression is overall that this war is likely to sort of weaken Russia geopolitically. It's sort of dragging, I mean, its army has been shown to be much weaker. It's dragging the Russia into kind of this seemingly no-win guerrilla warfare. I mean, how can you kind of speculate a little bit about how a weakened Russia might affect Georgian Russian relations down the line?
Okay, I think it will. I think the perception is that it probably will. I think the kind of pro-Russian drift of the Georgian government was, which is obvious, I think was partly caused by perception, public perceptions that Russia is getting stronger and the West is getting weaker in the region. And so the propaganda of pro-Russians, call them pro-Russian or call them whatever, people who are kind of more anti-Western, is that it's counterproductive to rely on the West because the West will not help you really, and Russia is here. So it's better to get a better deal with Russia rather than rely on the West. And as I said, the initial rhetoric of the Georgian government was like that, you know, sanctions is a joke, who cares for sanctions, and nobody can stop Russia. And if people see that Russia lost, and what the outcome of the war, whatever it will be perceived as Russia, I mean, showing weakness of Russia, I think it will undermine also this kind of perception, but also those forces which relied on strengthening that perception. So it's another problem, I think, that Georgian opposition is now extremely confused, in disarray and fragmented and in very bad shape. So people on the one hand hope that the defeat of Russia will mean weakening of the government, which is both increasingly authoritarian and increasingly pro-Russian. But whether we will have strong enough alternative forces to take advantage of that is another point, of course.
Thanks. Ed, you want to talk about sort of the potential longer-term impact of a kind of weakened Russia on Russian-Kazakhstan relations?
Sure. Well, I mean, a couple of so much of the long term depends on what happens in the near term. But I mean, the near term, you know, questions about what do sanctions force, you know, aspects of the Russian economy, what adjustments occur in the wake of sanctions, right? One of the possibilities here is, you know, the flight of certain businesses to seemingly friendly places. Kazakhstan would be kind of top of the list, right? You've got high GDP per capita, reasonably stable legal system, at least for major industries and so on. So you could see a deepening of economic ties. I know that wasn't your question about the military stuff, but I do think that more than anything else guides sort of the orientation of the Kazakhstani regimes to date, right? Which is to say where they see the economic possibilities and ties. I also think that there's something that we could talk about. We could talk about the weakness. Lucan, you and I should have this conversation offline about, you know, there's weakness, and then there's weakness with, you know, nuclear and chemical and biological weapons in your back pocket, right? which it starts to seem very unlike weakness. And I think that the rhetoric that we've seen, which is both coming from the far right in Russia, also a little bit from Putin as well, that questions Kazakhstani sovereignty, combined with the willingness to use language about escalating, about no commitments to avoid using biological, chemical, or nuclear weapons. I mean, I think all of this stuff lands pretty hard in Kazakhstan. So I'm not sure if the short term, battlefield failures necessarily change anything in terms of the overall relationship, power relationship between Kazakhstan and Russia. But the wild card here, and there's not enough time to go into it, would be China, of course. How does China step in to Central Asia in a way to while avoiding some major confrontation with Russia? China's obviously trying to be the silent, almost invisible partner with Russia. Seems like they've been able to thread the needle so far, but if they're forced to tip in a direction which makes sanctions bite a little harder, then we start to see a changing configuration of alliances, which has implications for Central Asia as well.
Okay, thank you. I think we're going to unfortunately have to wrap it up there. There are a lot of good questions, but well, maybe let's do one more. I think just maybe I think a lot of us, I noticed in the chat, are kind of confused by the fact that, for example, I think it was mentioned in Turkey that there's kind of 50%, almost 50% support for Putin. I mean, at least when you watch Western media and you see sort of all the coverage of the atrocities that Russia has committed in Ukraine, I mean, that seems really high, Professor Aydin. I mean, can you just comment on is it why? I mean, I have to say I had the same when I was in Halifax with my Pakistani in-laws. My wife is going to be really angry at me. I mean, many of them sort of you didn't support Putin, but it was a sort of a higher, there's more sympathy than I would have thought, given, what's going on. So she just talked a lot about why, despite everything, would people support Putin, this awful man, Putin?
Well, no, actually it is more than 50%, maybe, I don't know, I don't remember the number, but maybe like 60% for support for Ukraine, the last poll I saw, but maybe not as you expected, right? You would expect 80, 90%. As I said, it is partly because of this, it's not like they're pro-Putin, I think, but they're more like anti-NATO. I think this is kind of legacy of, I mean, Ed would know much more about this writing, anti-Americanism. But there is very entrenched anti-Americanism, I would say, in the Middle Eastern world, or what you would say, non-Western world, maybe. And this is due to the legacy of, what is done in, Iraq and Afghanistan. And people always come with the argument that, how sensitive people are to, Ukrainian refugees. They're not as sensitive, right? Turkey, who has, went through all these issues, they see it as kind of a double standard, maybe, but it's mostly, I would say, anti-NATO rather than. So I think NATO has to do some kind of, maybe not propaganda, but kind of an advertising work, or I mean, to show it is, for democracy. I mean, to prove in these non-Western populations, really, this time, it really means democracy.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you to all my panelists, Professor Filiz Aydin, Professor David Marples, Edward Schatz, Professor Ghia Nodia. It's been wonderful to talk to you. Before we end, I want to sort of, many of you are concerned and want to sort of donate to the Ukrainian cause, and I strongly encourage you to do that. We're posting on the chat a link to, there are many good places to give, for either refugees or for the military effort, and I really strongly encourage you to do that. Please join us also for our next panel on, we have a number of panels coming up. You should look at the schedule. Our next regional panel will be on April 7th. We're going to be co-hosting with the Asian Institute to talk about, one of the biggest players in this conflict, which is China, and where that's going. So thank you all very much for joining us, and thank you. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.